it's me. I'm so pleased to be sitting up here with my old friend and associate, Phil Collins. When I first met Phil back in the day, he was still working in the city. He was a rising star of the centre-left thinking and ideas, and he was incredibly good-humoured about the fact that people always asked him, do you prefer Susudio to in the air tonight? Right? He really took it in good part. But
he's rather tired of it.
Wait, there's a second bit because I think karma is a very, very beautiful thing, and I like to think that the aging, decrepit other Phil Collins now shambles around windswept parts of Switzerland, and that tourists walk up to him in his parka and flat cap and say, hey, what was it like being Tony Blair's favourite speechwriter and being the beloved columnist of the New Statesman? And I just think that probably the other Phil Collins doesn't take it in quite the same spirit of bonhomous good humour. But anyway, that's all totally irrelevant to what we're talking about.
Can I tell you a story about that? The only time my name actually had any impact was when I was working for Tony Blair. And Peter Gabriel came into Downing Street to lobby us about performance rights. Gabriel came in with Bob Geldof, and was an incredibly eloquent advocate for performance rights for artists. And I went down to join the meeting. And I went up to him and he held out his hand. He said, "Hello, I'm Peter Gabriel." And I said, "Hello, I'm Phil Collins." I'm so pleased we could finally get back together again. At which he dutifully laughed. And Blair looked at us both and he said, "Do you two know each other?"
Yes, happy days. On which subject? We're going to talk about speeches in this first session, and we're also going to look at some clips, and you're going to explain to us why things work and why things don't work, which used to be called audiovisual aids when I was at school, but I don't think it's called that anymore. So Phil, just as a extremely practiced speechwriter and speech analyst, give us some idea of how a speech comes to be, because it can be a very long process, can't it?
It can be very long, and it's usually too long. It shouldn't be that long. It's usually made worse the longer it gets on, because a sort of staleness sets in. If you think of something really good on the first day, by the time you've repeated it 25 times to a committee of 10 people, everyone's lost patience with it. So it shouldn't be too long. There also shouldn't be too many people involved, because think of it, the old speechwriter's line that if everyone has a veto on a joke will never get made. If you've got 6 people and they've all got a veto on whether or not to make a joke, if one of them says no, that joke won't go in. But if 5 out of 6 people laughed in any auditorium, that is a remarkably successful joke. So you've got to have a sort of editorial control. And then in the process of composition, the central thing is what Cicero calls the topic, is what Aristotle calls the seat of the argument. If you can't tell me in a sentence what you're trying to say, then the chances are you don't know. And if you don't know, you're not going to be able to do the selection necessary to truncate the process. So I spend a lot of time, whenever I'm doing this, trying to get to a pithy encapsulation of what my thing is. This is often maligned as a soundbite. Alistair will talk about this later, I'm sure. But it's an absurd way of thinking about it, because actually to come to a clear sort of maxim, which will be the inspiration of the rest of the speech, is in fact incredibly good discipline. To be or not to be, that is the question. If Shakespeare put out a press release, that's what he'd have on the top of it. Yeah. And
he'd be asked what the answer was on Newsnight as well.
He would.
Yes.
And so that's what I'm always trying to do. I'm trying to find what is the driving force, what's the propulsion of this speech.
And how do you, what does it take to get the kind of rapport you have with Blair, and obviously Obama had with Jean Favreau, and it's actually not that often that rapport arises, I suspect.
It's not often, no, and it comes just through proximity and time, and it doesn't always arise. I mean, I've worked with lots of people in the private sector subsequently where it's never quite happened. I've spent time with them, I know how they talk, and I can do a reasonable job of mimicking their voice, or in some cases creating their voice, but I haven't got that kind of connection with them, whereas with Blair I just did. I think it partly came out of the fact that he always used to ask me about my mum's politics, because I'm very, very fortunate as a political analyst in that I come from a town which always picks the winner. Always. Bury North, that's all you need to know. There's no need for a general election. You just ask the people in the Barracks Club in Elton in Bury, what do they think? And that's the answer, right? And my mum was working class Tory, and that's exactly the kind of person, obviously, that Tony was interested in. You know, in the days when the Labour Party wanted Conservatives to vote for them, which happily, I think, are coming back. And he was always wanted to ask me about that. So we kind of got on because we were two small C Conservatives in the room. And there was a rapport there right from the start. He also was very impressed that I'd once played football at Wembley. So I think that was, of the two things, that was probably the more important.
Probably the big thing. And what was, I mean, you know, I'm sure that the process varied from speech to speech, but broadly speaking, what was the MO?
Yeah, there was a kind of rhythm that established itself. And when I started, you know, you're nervous and keen, and I used to take everything terribly seriously. So we'd have a meeting a couple of weeks out where all the team would be gathered and there'd be a sort of relatively unmethodical discussion about what was going to be in the speech. And I'd be issued with some sort of orders. And I'd go away and I'd write the speech. And I'd give it to him with perhaps a week to go before delivery. And he wouldn't really read it because obviously he's not ready yet to engage. And so he'd send it back and he'd say, oh, well, you should have put this in it and this, and I wanted to say that. And I used to make the mistake of saying to him at that point, no, all those things that are in it, look. I realised that what I should do at this point is take it back, say you're quite right.
How right you are.
Absolutely. Yeah. And then give it back essentially the same draft the next day. And at which he said, oh, that's what I wanted. Excellent. Yeah. But then it would get really serious with about a day to go. I'd dread the call from the office to say, have you got the speech? And I'd barely started. And I'd rapidly write something for him. And then the very morning of the speech, I would usually get into Downing Street about 6 o'clock in the morning. No one else there apart from him. I'd go up to the flat and he'd be sitting in the corner there in his dressing gown. It's an unedifying scene and it's not going to get any better. And he'd have the text in front of him, and he'd be scribbling away on a fountain pen, and he'd be writing a political introduction, and he'd be writing through it and writing an ending. And then what we do is we'd cut and paste my body of the text, the central core argument, and his political additions. And when I say cut and paste, I don't mean some newfangled computer language. I mean, actually, we would cut it with scissors and glue it together and take it down.
Stick
we did have a Pritt stick. And
Tony's Pritt stick.
Yeah, it was like a sort of, child's homework assignment. Yeah. And then I'd take it downstairs to be typed, and then that would be typed up. And remarkably, it sort of worked. It shouldn't have worked, because it's not a process I'd suggest anybody ever emulates, but it did sort of work. The things flowed.
Were there ever any, particularly one imagines with conferences, the kind of sense of big occasion, big theatre. Were there ever sort of any essay crisis nights where it was, oh my God, this isn't quite right, for various reasons the tone needs to be adjusted?
There was. And in fact, in really a prophetic speech in a way, as it turned out. 2005, Tony had a speech at the European Parliament. It's one of the first ones I'd done on my own, actually. And I prepared this speech because Britain was taking over the presidency of the European Union. And he had to deliver this speech to the European Parliament. And there's lots of protocols you have to observe and courtesies that have to be paid. And I'd written this speech of really dull, absolutely, really profoundly dull courtesy. And I'd paid every respect, and it was fine, but there was nothing in it. And then the day before it was due, Jean-Claude Juncker, then I think the outgoing Prime Minister of Luxembourg, delivered a speech on the floor of the European Parliament in which he absolutely excoriated the British for not paying for scuppering the budget negotiations. Yeah. There have been so many scores in Europe, I can't remember precisely which one it was, but that's what we were charged with. And it was a withering attack on the British Anglo-Saxon model, and you know the script. And we were by then in Brussels, in the hotel, and we either had to carry on with the speech as we had, or respond, and he decided we'd respond. So we tore up the speech, and with a few hours to go, started again. And he delivered a speech which was one of the best I've ever been involved in, and I wouldn't say I wrote it all because it was hastily cobbled together by a few people. And it contained one of my favourite lines, actually, where he says, the people are sounding the trumpets on the city walls, but is anybody listening? It was the case that the European Union is not responding to globalization washing up on the shores of people. And this is 2005. It's quite as it turns out, to be a really prophetic argument, and particularly prophetic about Britain's place within Europe as well. And so that was a real essay crisis one, and brought out some of the very best things we ever did.
But before we move into the Dr. Phil stage of the session, where you analyse bits of rhetoric, has the craft changed? I mean, I spoke to one quite senior Labour politician the other day who said, with a certain amount of shame, that actually they were now writing speeches with a view to clips on Twitter and Instagram. And I said, really? They said, it's just the game. It's just the game. So has that had an effect? Has speech writing changed?
Yes, it has, because that happens, but I don't really lament it. So also no, because for the reason I gave at the start, which is that if you're approaching it, trying to encapsulate your argument in the best possible pithiest maxim, then you could think of that as 140 or 280 characters. So that is a tweet. So you still ought to have the discipline to think that the clips that I want to be shown and shared are the clips which tell my story. So actually, it's just an amplification of my central thought. So yes, of course, it's changed, but I don't lament it because more people are seeing them. Yeah. Because and the other way of thinking about that is that you write a speech back in the day when it was published verbatim in the Times, or even when they were under the excellent editorship of the Times and with a brilliant analyst. There was a.
Those were the days.
I mean, do you remember? Those were the days. But nobody's as serious as that now.
No.
Your speech, except here, of course, your speeches reach more people now than they've ever done before. Yeah. So I think you should look on the positive side of that and think, well, I've got this opportunity to reach people who never dream of watching a party conference speech. What do I want to say to them? And can I try and ensure that message is the one that they get shared? So yes, they've changed, but in a sense for the better.
Well, in a smooth segue to people who madly sabotage economic growth and are for some reason against anything that's good for the country, and are podcasters and yoga instructors and members of Talking Heads as well, who I'm not quite sure why they got it. But anyway, we're going to look at Liz Truss's speech, which I think we can all agree was Liz Truss's speech. Let's not polarise on that, guys. Can we run a bit of Run VT?
In these tough times, we need to step up. I'm determined to get Britain moving, to get us through the tempest, and to put us on a stronger footing as a nation. I've juggled my career with raising 2 wonderful daughters. I know how it feels to have your potential dismissed by those who think they know better. I remember as a young girl being presented on a plane with a junior air hostess badge. Meanwhile, my brothers were given junior pilot badges. That's why I promised on entering Downing Street to act. Let's get them removed. Now, later on in my speech, my friends, I'm going to talk about the anti-growth coalition. But I think they arrived in the hall a bit too early. They were meant to come later on, so we'll get on to them. And for too long, the political debate has been dominated by the argument about how we distribute a limited economic pie. Instead, we need to grow the pie so that everyone gets a bigger slice. I have 3 priorities for our economy: growth, growth, and growth.
your references to Martin Luther King, Lincoln, and John F. Kennedy, because superlatives kind of get out of hand. What the hell was going on there?
It's sort of excruciating, isn't it?
There's no sort of about it, Phil.
A number of things. I mean, firstly, at the level of writing, obviously, if you had read that out loud yourself before, you might have had the thought, pies don't grow. Wouldn't you? Pies are just made, and you could make a bigger one, but the metaphor's dead on arrival.
That pie isn't big enough.
That pie... I want a different pie.
A different pie that's larger.
A larger pie, yeah. We'll have more. Yeah. Or maybe we'll have another pie.
Yes.
But the moment you get into this very interesting pie discussion, you realise that it's pie in the sky. Yeah, so, you can see I've done this before. You realise that's just not a metaphor that's ever going to work, and it's ridiculous. And everyone is going to be the centrepiece of the speech. So it was terribly written, terribly wooden. Even in that clip, you saw a number of cliches. So really, really completely leaden.
And what made? I mean, this is probably quite a long list, but what made your toes curl most as a practitioner? That you thought, oh God, come on, you can do better than that, even in these circumstances.
Right at the beginning of that clip, where he said, "We're going to step up."
Yeah.
And get Britain moving. They're such tired thoughts. They're such boring metaphors. We've heard them all before. They're completely dead metaphors. And there's nothing vivid in the language. So it just there's nothing being said. And I mean, that's at the root of it, that there's nothing being said, in fact. And her animus is trained against people. Who are they? These anti-growth coalition. I mean, it's ridiculous. It's everybody. It's like there's a great clip on YouTube of a football fan walking down an alley, and at the bottom of which there's about 10,000 Millwall fans. And there's no way out of this alley, and the guy goes, "Come on, I'll have the lot of you." And that's what she's sort of doing there. And he gets beaten to a pulp in the clip. And
it's never a good idea. Probably not a good basis upon which to govern the country.
No.
One assumes.
It's one of the things she's doing.
What do you think is... I mean, it's interesting because what is going on there? Psychologically, why... Is it simply because she's not looking beyond the room? Is she even looking at the room?
I think you've got to... what she's doing is trying to find a division. You're trying to find something in the speech. All speech is like Aaron Sorkin on... have you ever seen his masterclass on writing? It goes on for about an hour and a half, but he's only got one point, which is that writing is about conflict.
Yeah.
And he's right. He just doesn't have anything else to say. And she's trying to find a conflict. So within any speech, your governing idea has to be something with which someone can disagree. Most speech writing falls over and becomes banal because the original proposition is a platitude. And if I say something like, I'm going to write a speech about why our people in this company are our greatest asset, there's no speech to be given along those lines because no one in their right mind will say our people are idiots and we should get rid of all of them. Even if that's true, they won't say that. So there's no real conflict there. And so she's looking for a conflict, and my God, has she found one.
She confects one.
she confects one.
Yeah.
She's confecting one. It's like Ed Miliband did the same, didn't he, with producers versus predators.
Yeah.
You confect. It's a conflict of your own devising, and it's really, really pitiful and bad. And I would have just avoided it because actually in the 25 minutes she gave herself, there's plenty to say without having to do that. And I've got more sympathy with that section where she tells a personal story. Yeah. Now, it's not a particularly great one. It doesn't go anywhere. With those stories, what you want to do, of course, they should become metaphors for who you are. Yeah. So, like when I was involved in Keir Starmer's speech last year, when he talked about his parents, it's an introduction to the nation. And my favourite moment was when he said my dad was a tool maker and so in a way was Boris Johnson. My contribution is usually like mucky jokes like that. But that was an attempt. What we did with that was to pull it all the way through so that your personal biography is not just a series of detached and orphaned memoir at the front. It becomes the frame through which the political life can be understood. So I believe in these things because of this experience. Now, if that was a speech on a sort of Germaine Greer, a speech on feminism, and my feminism was born on a plane when I was forced to be the hostess and not the pilot, well, then that would have had some metaphorical impact. But it wasn't. It was just an orphan at the beginning, and it died. And so she needed to thread that story through, or indeed find a better one. But we needed some indication of why she thinks what she thinks, because that then gives her permission to say, in the midst of the chaos, well, I know it's not gone as well as it might have done, but these are my beliefs. This is why I think this, and this is why in the fullness of time I think this will work.
Is she right, Phil, to denounce the preceding 12 years of Conservative government quite as explicitly as she has? I mean, there are people who would argue you've got to do it when you've had a moment as dire as the Johnson implosion. But
do you know, I would have done the opposite. I would have done the opposite. I would have done, there are risks both ways because, of course, the character of those governments has changed remarkably. I mean, the extraordinary adaptability of the Conservative Party has never been on greater show than over this last decade. From coalition to a solid and stable government of Theresa May to Boris Johnson's sort of Gaullism to Liz Truss's libertarianism. It's really, really been remarkable. And so I understand the requirement to define yourself against your predecessor. Gordon Brown did the same when he took over from Tony Blair to no great effect. I think time is too short for that.
Yeah.
I don't think she's got time to do it. And I think the circumstances are too bad. Even before they were exacerbated by Kwasi Kwarteng's budget, the circumstances were just intrinsically bad. It's worth saying that often we judge a speech and we say, oh, she's so weak. But actually, she is weak. The actual real strategic position is in fact weak. It's not a product or a property of her poor rhetoric. It's a fact to which her
it's
rhetoric
not a presentational dilemma. It's a given.
No, exactly.
Yeah.
No one really ever had a communication problem who didn't have a problem.
Yeah.
And she has a real problem. So I would have done the opposite. I would have said, and this would be just as audacious, given those changes in political complexion. I would have said, we, this party, have been in power for 12 years, and what a good 12 years it's been. And then you've got the chance to enlist the Michael Gove reform in schools. You've got years of the health service with good funding, relatively good funding. You've got things you can say. You can then do a sort of Gordon Brown list of achievements, which is lauding Conservative government. I would have made the dividing line Conservative versus Labour.
Yeah.
Not controversial, I wouldn't have thought, but these days it is controversial because all the dividing lines are within the parties.
The anti-Conservative coalition.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so I would have done that we are the custodians of growth. Look at how we managed to salvage an economy when it was on the brink of disaster, you would say, and we paid down the deficit. Of course, we've got back into trouble again. Not our fault, as you know, because of the necessity of supporting people during COVID. And I would have taken on the 12 years and therefore had something to say. Yeah. I would have had a record to run on. Because at the moment, her record is 3 weeks long and it's calamitous.
Yes.
So I would have gone for 12 years.
And it's based on the votes of about 37 people.
Yes.
So it's not
exactly.
an ideal thing.
So to put herself in the tradition of the Conservative Party, even the immediate tradition of the 12 years, and then a longer tradition of previous incumbents would have been a bolder and I think a more sustainable move.
No, definitely. On the subject of Labour and prospective change, let's have a look at Keir Starmer and compare and contrast. Run VT.
What we've seen in the past few days has no precedent. The government has lost control of the British economy. And for what? They've crashed the pound. And for what? Higher interest rates, higher inflation, higher borrowing. And for what? Not for you, not for working people, for tax cuts for the richest 1% in our society. Conference, I knew in April 2020, when I became leader of this party, we had a big task before us. We had to change our party and prepare for power all in one go. Not change for change's sake. Change with a purpose. To make our party fit to serve our country. That's why we had to rip out anti-Semitism by its roots. That's why we had to show our support for NATO is non-negotiable. Show we want business to prosper. Shared unworkable policy. Country first, party second.
I thought myself, country first, party second was a bit of a punctuation mark.
Yeah.
What do you reckon?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a mark of seriousness, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's like, we want to win.
Yeah.
And I know that's a low bar to say you want to win in democracy, but
it has to.
the Labour Party
it's a
doesn't
precondition,
like
isn't
winning.
it? Anyone who wants to be Prime Minister has to think that.
They do, and they have to mean it and have to do the things that it then implies. I mean, the Labour Party is a party that quite enjoys glorious failure, or sometimes inglorious failure. I remember one of the very last times I think probably the last time that Tony Blair went to the NEC as Prime Minister, I just happened to go with him, and he asked at the end of the proceedings, which were always a tough time for him, because they didn't like him, the NEC of the Labour Party. He asked, can I just make a few final remarks, as this will be my last occasion before you? And they graciously allowed the Prime Minister to speak to them. And he said, I just want to say that I was loyal to this party through 3 terrible defeats, and all I've ever asked from you in return is that you should be loyal to me through 3 terrible victories. And there was a sort of silence in the room. And the point he was making was that you find this difficult, don't you? You find this uncomfortable, that victory requires compromise. It requires saying things, the likes of which Keir was saying there, about NATO and patriotism, which don't...
Bevan as well as Bevan.
Yeah, exactly, which don't come that easily to the conference hall in the Labour Party. They come perfectly easy to Labour voters, but they don't come easily to the Labour Party. And so it's at the moment when you're pushing against the grain of what's going on in the hall that you realise this is somebody who's become very serious.
I mean, what was interesting is that when he became leader in April 2020, it was, the first weeks of lockdown. I mean, one can hardly imagine a harder context in which to become Labour leader, inheriting a disastrous 2019 general election result. And there have been, a lot of his early months were spent with the story being the pandemic. The story then became the breakdown of the Tory party and the Ukraine war. And yet, he does seem to have done what I thought he couldn't do, which is to get quite a long way in shifting the party in a very short time. I mean, New Labour didn't happen between Blair becoming leader in 94 and the general election of 97. But actually, Starmer seems to me to have brought about a fair amount of change in quite a short time.
I think he has. I think politics has accelerated. I mean, you've written about this a lot yourself, and I think you've seen that in the Labour Party, that when he became leader, he said, and has said many times, we have to do in one fell swoop what took more than a decade last time. We have to recover and then try and win. We have to do Kinnock as well as Blair. And he's obviously helped by the opposition. Somebody's got to win. And so if you sit still and do nothing, you turn out to be a genius. So he's been helped by the Conservative Party, but he's been serious. I think lockdown helped him, actually. I mean, it's conventional to think it was a bad thing for him politically because it delayed the moment at which he could define himself. But in fact, I think it was a good thing because I don't think he was ready to define himself at that moment. And I think the moment may have passed. And I know because I wrote the speech in his first conference speech, right in the middle of lockdown. He delivered it to an empty room in Doncaster, just to an auto cue. There was no one there, and it was an absolute gift that there was nobody there because no one was interested. And it allowed me to write a really wildly hardcore speech about victory. It was a speech about, I'm going to be in the tradition of Clem Attlee and Ernest Bevin, and I'm going to be Harold Wilson, who was a winner. Yeah, and I'm going to be Tony Blair. And the story of all three, the 2 themes of that speech, which he's then taken with him. 2 themes are, one, when Labour wins, it's always because of a story of modernising the country. Always. That's the only thing that Labour governments are there for. And secondly, all 3 of those leaders had a conservative streak, a small c conservative streak. Attlee, Wilson and Blair all understood the country of which they were wanted to govern, and they liked it. And that was the thesis. And if that had been delivered then to a packed hall in a Labour Party conference, he'd have been booed. It would have been a disaster. In fact, we wouldn't have done it. So it allowed him to say those words, and then he could repeat them and say, oh, no, I said that last year. So actually, there was a really strange virtue of not having an audience.
One of the things that interests me about Starmer is his lawyerliness, because Blair was a lawyer too, but it seemed to me that what he'd learned from the law was a kind of theatricality. He was a performer. He was a natural. He didn't treat the practice of politics as a lawyer. Whereas at the start, at least, I felt that Starmer had fallen into the entirely reasonable but wholly disastrous trap of believing that being forensic and winning the argument and offering facts would win the political debate. But he's not like that now. There's a spirit and a passion. Yeah. Where's that come from? How's that?
He learns quickly. He realizes that he spent his 40s doing law and fighting cases and becoming director of public prosecutions. It's a serious job. And he, in a funny way, didn't have political instincts, really. And and that's both a vice and a virtue, because sometimes he didn't react to things. He didn't understand that this was an important signal moment. He needed to respond. So he's learning it. He's learning politics on the job, and he's a quick learner. And you're right, he was too lawyerly at first. And the first conundrum with writing with Keir was to try and think, well, what character is plausible? Because you've only got what you've got, and you can shape them to some extent. And political character isn't quite the same as what you're actually like, but it has to be rooted in that, because an audience sniffs it out. And the fact that he was forensic and lawyerly was a good thing too, and serious and grave, but it's not quite enough. And he has attached to it now a kind of passion. I think Blair was a lawyer in one sense, in that his capacity to see the centrality of an argument, to see what mattered and press down hard on weakness, was brilliant. He could see things so quickly. And that's really helpful when you're writing for him, because that's what I'm searching for too. So he was brilliant in that sense. The other great lawyer, politician of recent times, of course, is Obama. And Obama's really done that leap, but he did it in reverse. So Obama came to power, living out the Mario Cuomo phrase, he came to power on this tide of elevated rhetoric, beautiful about, flora and fauna and God knows what, and the world's going to be better. And then the brilliantly impressive thing about Obama is the moment he became president, he switched.
On the night?
Yeah, absolutely switched. And his first speeches as president are really sober. And they are saying in idiom, I'm the president of the United States now, and I'm really serious about it.
Yes, we can possibly.
Yeah. Yes. Well, we might.
Well, we might, exactly. Exactly.
We'll have to see.
It's interesting because one of those sort of governing principles of New Labour was that the collapse of your opponent, the then governing Tories, is not the same as you winning. And I think that is true and remains true. And so one of the things I've always thought with Starmer is I can totally see him sitting in the study in number 10. I can totally see him at the G7. I can totally see him at Davos or representing the country. That's not a problem. The problem I initially had was, how do I get him in there? What now? So the question is, do you think he has what Marines call the sand to go through a really bruising campaign and do that kind of thing, but everywhere?
Yes, I don't think he's of the highest rank in that, so it might be a bumpy road, but yes, I think he is. I think he's gradually acquiring that steel. I think the point you make about the fact that you can see him there is absolutely critical, though, because it's the first test, isn't it? I was talking to, my good friend and yours, Lord Finkelstein, last night in his new dispensation as a director of Chelsea Football Club. We was there, and we, like every
football tycoon.
Exactly, and like everybody in the ground, we were discussing Ed Miliband.
Yeah, and a great tradition of the club.
They all were, and what we were saying, in fact, was we were remembering the 2015 election night, and the two of us, Danny and me, were on the ITV show, and it was just before midnight, and the poll was about to come in. And I said to Danny on set, I said, if Ed Miliband becomes Prime Minister, then everything I know about politics is wrong. Because the only insight I'd had in the few years before that was that he just won't be Prime Minister.
Yeah.
I'm not interested in arguing why not. I don't know. He just won't. And I'm just saying it's the opposite of that test. You can see him, and I couldn't see him. And that belief that Keir could be Prime Minister is a very important part of the fact that he might be. So I think if your opponent really does collapse, and they don't then reflate.
And they're certainly doing their best.
And they're doing the best, then you will win. It's a matter of sheer arithmetic.
Yes.
But you might not be very good when you get there. So that's the thing that I think about now when I'm watching the Labour Party conference. I took two thoughts out of it. One is that Keir Starmer will be Prime Minister, which I've thought for a number of years, and I definitely think it now. Two, I'm not sure what the nature of that Labour government will be. So I think
Why? Because you see ideological rifts or personality clashes or both?
Not yet. There's a discipline that's come into the Labour Party and a desire for victory. But I don't think, beyond the correction of things that are being supplied by the Conservative Party, I don't think it's obvious yet what that Labour government will be for. And I think that the demands for a vision, which you get all the time when you're in opposition, you've got to give us a vision, are redundant with respect to victory. I don't think you need a vision at all because no one's really listening. But if you haven't done that work in opposition and you've got a real programme and a plan for what you're going to be, then when the inevitable tempest comes of events, you'll find yourself in difficulty. So I worry at the moment that the Labour Party is quite a long way behind the process of distilling for itself what it's actually going to be like.
It's going to have a massive social emergency to deal with for a start, isn't it?
It is.
And maybe that will provide
maybe that will be enough. And maybe what we'll have is a sort of 64 to 66 Wilson period in which Starmer proves himself to be an entirely worthy occupant of the office. The government's perfectly sensible. That feels like a bit of a change of course after the last few years of pantomime madness. And then you have another election and you win a more substantial majority. That's entirely possible, I would think.
Speaking of golden oldies, let's end with one and have a little bit of the Iron Lady. Conor, I don't know if you've still got that teed up. That'd be great if you could.
To those waiting with bated breath for that favourite media catchphrase, the U-turn, I have only one thing to say. U-turn if you want to. The ladies not for turning.
So I think I'm right. It was Ronald Miller wrote that line.
It was. It was. Yes, that's right.
And I mean, now it seems like a sort of Monty Python skit because we're so used to it. But actually, it must have been quite something to see. And you can see Geoffrey Howe and Carrington going, bloody hell.
Yeah.
How do moments like that come about? Is it organic or personal or a group of people saying we're going to go for it?
It can only be done if you've got a central character who can carry it. And so the reason that works, it was Ronald Miller who wrote it, and there was quite a strong split, a separation between the speaker and the writer with Ronnie Miller and Margaret Thatcher, as there was with Reagan and Peggy Noonan. That's rare, in fact. It's usually much more collaborative and organic. But with them, it was quite separate. And she knew what she wanted to say, but he found the words. And it's a quotation of a Christopher Fry play. She's got no idea what she's saying. It doesn't mean anything to her. But it's absolutely in character. And that's why it is. You can go back to Aristotle and find the three components of plausible rhetoric are your rational argument, your emotional connection, and your strong sense of character, your credentials. The person is carrying the message. And it just so chimes exactly with what people thought of her. And so it's a brilliant piece of writing because it's entirely in character. And although she's not conventionally a great political speaker, she delivers that well because there's a slight edge of menace in it. And that's what she can do. She could do menace. And that was good. And when she was good, they played that up. It's interesting you mentioned Monty Python. There's a famous story that John Whittingdale always tells about the Liberal Democrats had just issued a new logo, which looked a bit like a sort of parrot, or at least in the estimation of the speechwriters, it looked like a parrot. So they got Mrs. Thatcher to do the dead parrot sketch live on the stage. And she had no idea what she was saying. So in the most preposterously wooden way, she went through the whole routine. So this is a dead parrot. It has gone to meet its maker. And it was absolutely appalling. And at the end, she came off the stage and she said to John Whittingdale, "This Monty Python, is he one of us?"
But it's interesting with that line, though, because it has become almost, part of the unwritten constitution, hasn't it? It's so famous. Yeah. And you're right that the menace was the key, not least menace towards members of her own government whom she felt were wavering. Specifically, has it actually led to a absurd approach in the media and in government towards U-turns?
Yes, it has, because for the most part...
You can't do it,
Yeah, for the most part, it's absurd, isn't it? You've made a mistake, you should change your mind, say, "Oh, I'm sorry, I got that slightly wrong." obviously that happens all the time in real life.
Yes.
And yet we've kind of sort of absolutely in concrete, you can't turn. And I was going to say, the other thing that makes that an effective piece of rhetoric and why we still remember it is that it was true. And there's a very interesting relationship in rhetoric between truth and falsehood. And it's there right at the start. Aristophanes is the first to say in the Clouds that rhetoric is the art of deception. And he chastises Socrates for making the weaker argument the stronger argument. This idea of duplicity, it's just rhetoric, is something which runs through the whole history of the subject. And there is a truth, though, and that if you say something which is just doesn't ring true or turns out to be false, you'll be punished for it. So she can say the lady's not for turning because it was so evidently true, and she didn't, at least not on that issue. Whereas when Liz Truss implies similar things, and then the next day she does, you're completely caught out. So there is a truth value in rhetoric. It's not just duplicity. And I often say when I'm writing with people that we can stretch things, we can exaggerate, we can inflame, because there's a certain creative license in the writing. It's not just factual reportage. But if at root we're saying something that we don't think will turn out to be true, we're going to be in trouble. And so I think that there's a sort of rhetorical truth in what she's saying as well, which is in character. I think in a very different context, and I'm not comparing her to him, I think Donald Trump had something of the same.
I was going to ask you about him as a sort of final theme, really, which is that there is a kind of orthodoxy that Trump has debased the great art of American rhetoric and perhaps rhetoric generally, and that the rallies that he has are, a lowering of the democratic process generally. I wonder if the truth is not a bit more complex.
I think both those things are true. I mean, the worst example of the debasing was in the campaign, his first campaign, and Trump went to Gettysburg, which is it's a battlefield, it's a cemetery. The war dead are lying around. And every American president goes to Gettysburg and delivers a Gettysburg address. And it's always a sort of rite. It's as close as you get to a religious moment in a secular republic, because they go there to pay their respects, not just to Lincoln, but to the American Republic. Yeah. And they're repetitive speeches, but they're important speeches. And the only president who didn't do that, in fact, was Kennedy, who was due to give the 100-year anniversary speech at Gettysburg, but was called away to Dallas on very important party business a few days before, and of course never came back, and Eisenhower had to stand in for him. But Trump went to Gettysburg during the campaign, and instead of doing the 272 words of your homage to the American Constitution, he did 45 minutes of tirade against Hillary Clinton being a criminal and the American Constitution being rigged and the people being deprived of their liberty and the usual awful nonsense. I mean, it's terrible anywhere, but to go and do it there really was an absolute debasement. Terrible. It was absolutely terrible. That said, he is quite good. And he's quite good in the sense that, although he does not use rational ordered arguments, that 2016 election campaign was like a laboratory for rhetorical analysts, because on the one hand, you had a candidate in Hillary Clinton she had a 5-point plan for everything. You wake up and have breakfast, and it said, Bill, we've got a 5-point plan for breakfast. She was brilliant at having answers to every single conceivable question, apart from the one overriding question, which is, who is Hillary Clinton? Yeah. Whereas Donald Trump didn't even bother with rational arguments. His arguments swirled all over the place. But he was always Donald Trump. He was very Donald Trump-like at all times. And he had an emotional connection. The former factory worker in Ohio thought that Donald Trump understood his pain. He talked in a way that made people feel he connected with them. And he did.
Feeling seen was a phrase that was used by a lot of voters.
I think it's very important.
And is that ultimately one of the key constituents of successful rhetoric?
Yes.
To make the listener and, by extension, the TV viewer or YouTube viewer, whatever, feel seen?
Absolutely, it is. It is. It's to make you feel as though I'm with you. And you can do that by evoking emotions as you can through rational arguments. And, you ideally, the perfect speakers have a blend of those things that all tend in the same direction. Somebody like Martin Luther King, an obvious example, Churchill, all the greats are bringing their rational argument to the service of their emotional connection. whereas Trump, they're disconnected. But he's brilliant at the emotional connection. I think the same could be said of the Brexit referendum, where if you just analyse it in technical terms, on the Remain side, you had a dry arithmetical projection of what will happen, which may or may not have been true, but was of a rational kind.
No, it was literally a blizzard of statistics.
It was. It really was. And it's abstract and not very memorable. Whereas on the other side, they're able to translate that into feelings, control, belonging, nationhood, things which are important. And I think it's easy to disparage those techniques because they're being carried out by people who I don't particularly like. But actually, there's nothing wrong with them. There's nothing wrong, in fact, with the Leave side using emotional arguments. That's the staple of rhetoric, and all the more of a greater shame that on the Remain side they weren't able to tell a similar story. And Trump was very, very good at that.
Final question, just to squeeze it in, for it's an unfair one, really, but it's, I know you observe American politics very closely as well as UK politics. Do you think that emotional connection that he forged in 1516 has been severed, or can it be renewed?
It's a very good question, and I'm not sure I know the answer definitively. My hunch is that it has been severed, but I don't want to be too sure about that because the consequences of me being wrong are obviously very, very significant.
The markets could go all over the place.
Yeah, I worry a lot about the Democrat Party for the reasons I gave about the Labour Party, which is I still don't think that the left in Britain or America has quite yet worked out what it means to be on the left in an era when there's no money to dispense. So the Democrat Party has got a geriatric leader, and I'm not quite sure where they're going. So I do worry that
well, he's not sure where he's going.
He's not sure where he's going, like sort of literally. But I don't see on the horizon either anybody coming through like Senator Obama, who bursts onto the scene with beautiful rhetoric. And I have lost count of how many people come to me, how many MPs come to me and say, "Can you make me a bit like Barack Obama?" And I always say to them, "Well, look, let me just count the ways in which you're not like Barack Obama."
Also, I suppose it's a definitional thing. You can't make someone like Barack Obama. They already are. Or
they already are.
Know, yeah.
And not just that, not just you're not Barack Obama, but also, which is quite a big thing.
Yeah, that's a coalition.
But also, you're not President of the United States of America, which gives you the right to a certain elevation. And thirdly, you're not a black man who's President of the United States of America in a nation in which many of its citizens remember segregated cities. Now, that's a story which is at his back every time he speaks. He's speaking on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, and you are going on just after lunch at the local government Chronicle.
Yes, and the audacity vote has its limits.
It really does.
We've just run over time. Phil, thank you so much. That's been absolutely fascinating. Please join me in thanking the